This is a work of historical fiction. While inspired by real events, locations, and themes from the American South during the 19th century, the characters, incidents, and specific portrayals in this story are the product of imagination. Any resemblance to actual people, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story contains mature themes including slavery, racial injustice, and historical trauma that may be distressing to some readers. The narrative seeks not to glorify or exploit the suffering of the past but to explore it with honesty and dignity. Reader discretion is advised. The land in Tennessee whispered when the wind came low over the cotton fields. It whispered in the cracks of the dry soil, in the rattling of brittle stalks that hadn't grown for decades. The house, what was left of it, leaned into the earth as though ashamed of what it had overseen. Some said the ground there was cursed. Others said it simply remembered too much. In the summer of 2025, a local historian named Eliza Monroe drove her aging Chevy pickup down the narrow, oak-lined road toward the Chamberlain estate. The property had just gone on the market again. Uninhabited, unwanted, and largely forgotten. But not to Eliza. She'd studied every plantation south of Nashville, but something about Chamberlain had always scratched at her curiosity. The records were incomplete. The stories fragmented. One line in a census report from 1863 had brought her here. Missing, 73. No known burial. Eliza parked near the crumbling gate. Her boots hit the gravel with purpose as she approached the once mighty manor. It was 2 stories of rotting wood and sunken shingles, overrun by ivy and shadow. A faded emblem above the main doorway read, "Virtue and strength in all things." "That's rich," she muttered, brushing a cobweb from the rusted doorknob. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and silence. Dust danced in shafts of sunlight coming through shattered windows. Furniture lay covered in sheets like ghosts too tired to rise. She walked through the halls with reverence, as if stepping through time. Then she saw it, an old family portrait above the hearth. The Chamberlains, Jonathan, tall and stern, Rebecca, his sharp-eyed wife, and 3 children dressed like little aristocrats, all unsmiling. But Eliza wasn't here for the family. She was here for the 73. In the late autumn of 1863, the Chamberlain estate was a kingdom unto itself. Stretching over 1,200 acres, it was one of the most profitable cotton plantations in Tennessee. That profit, however, came soaked in sweat and blood. The enslaved population, officially listed at 112, lived in narrow cabins on the east end of the property, near the tree line. Overseers ruled them with iron and ashwood. Whispers among the enslaved said that the Chamberlains had their own kind of justice, a pit behind the woodshed where no one returned from. Mariah was 15 when she was brought to the Chamberlain place. She had no family left, no hope of freedom, and a voice too soft to matter. She learned quickly that silence meant survival, and obedience meant the whip would bite less deep. But even then, something burned in her chest. Question, a hunger. Her eyes never stopped watching. One night, in late October, Mariah was fetching water when she heard it. Screams, sharp and sudden, coming from the overseer's quarters. Then silence. Then the sound of shovels. From that night on, the numbers in the fields grew thinner. Men and women vanished without warning. No one asked where they'd gone, not out loud. But the cabins buzzed with quiet terror. They called them the 73 in hushed tones, as if naming them gave the dead too much power. Some said they'd tried to escape and were caught. Others believed a fever had taken them. But Mariah didn't believe in mystery. She believed in cruelty. And the Chamberlains were full of it. Back in the present, Eliza descended into the basement of the main house, flashlight in hand. She had received permission from the county to investigate, technically. But she hadn't told them what she was really looking for. Under the sagging floorboards, she found a crawl space, and in it, an old trunk sealed with rusted iron. With some effort, she pried it open. Inside, old account books, journals, receipts for slave auctions, ledgers with notations like, runaway recovered, expenses paid, transfer of ownership, boy, approximate 12, No name given. Her heart sank. Then she found something else. A thin, leather-bound book with a broken clasp. Inside was a name written in uneven script. Mariah. The pages were brittle, but the ink was clear. It wasn't just a diary. It was a confession, a testimony, a memory the earth hadn't buried deep enough. In the weeks that followed, Eliza pieced together the horror. Mariah had recorded every vanishing, every name she could remember. She'd written about the October nights, about secret meetings, about screams carried off by wind. She described one night in particular, the 24th of October, 1863, when all the enslaved workers from cabins 3 to 9 were summoned after sundown. They never returned. In Mariah's words, they took them to the hollow. I heard the ground cry when the shovels stopped. I don't sleep. I don't breathe right. I know I'll be next. Eliza closed the book with trembling hands. She looked out the basement window toward the overgrown fields. And then she saw them. 73 stakes, weathered by time, barely visible unless you knew where to look. No names, no markers, just echoes. That night, as the wind howled through the Tennessee trees, Eliza stood in the cotton field with a lantern and a camera. The soil beneath her boots felt loose, soft, and the wind whispered again. But this time it said a name. Mariah. The year was 1820 when Jonathan Eli Chamberlain rode westward from South Carolina. His boots caked in red clay and ambition. A second son in a family of tobacco merchants, he had no inheritance, no standing, and no future under his father's thumb. But Tennessee was open land that promised wealth to the right kind of man. Ruthless, tireless, and white. He brought with him a young wife, Rebecca, who rarely smiled and never disobeyed. She was the daughter of a Charleston banker, bred for discipline and silence. Between them stood a fortune yet to be made. They bought 400 acres outside a growing village near Nashville, borrowing heavily against family names and fabricated credit. But Jonathan had a vision, not just for a farm, but for an empire of cotton. He began by clearing the forest with convict labor. But that wasn't fast enough. By 1823, the Chamberlains purchased their first 7 slaves at auction. 4 men, 2 women, and a girl barely 13. Within 3 years, that number had grown to 45. By 1830, it was 89. What began as farmland soon became a plantation. The cotton grew tall and profits soared with it. Jonathan expanded the landholdings aggressively, buying adjacent plots from bankrupt farmers and newly widowed landowners. He used his sharp tongue and cruel ledger to accumulate what others couldn't hold. The Chamberlain estate soon spread over 1,200 acres, an expanse of fertile earth and suffering. He named it Halcyon Grove, a name meant to imply peace, though there was none to be found there. The main house was built in 1836, a grand white column structure that looked like a courthouse dropped in the middle of wilderness. It had 3 chimneys, 14 rooms, and an iron bell above the front porch. The bell rang at dawn and dusk, a mechanical summons to labor. Within that house, Jonathan raised 3 children, David, Caroline, and Henry. Each was taught 2 things. Never question power, and never forget what paid for their silver spoons. Rebecca, who had long since stopped speaking in her husband's presence, retreated into her books and her garden. Some said she took laudanum to sleep. Others said she simply couldn't stand the screams. By 1840, the Chamberlains were among the most respected names in western Tennessee. They hosted politicians, plantation owners, and Confederate sympathizers. But behind the lace curtains and bourbon smiles, a darker truth fermented. The overseer, Elias Grigg, a former bounty hunter with scars down both arms, was given full authority over the enslaved. Jonathan Chamberlain believed in discipline with consequence. Elias believed in terror. In the slave quarters, which lined the eastern edge of the property in a staggered row of cabins, the days were relentless. The bell rang at 4:30 a.m., and work didn't stop until dusk, unless the yield was below expectation. Then it continued into the night. Children picked cotton with bloodied fingers. Mothers cooked meals for the main house before eating scraps themselves. Men too old to work were assigned to dig trenches, build fences, or haul lumber until they collapsed. Mariah arrived in 1858. She was born in Georgia, sold twice before her 10th birthday, and brought to Halcyon Grove on the back of a hay cart. She didn't remember her mother's face, only the lullabies. Mariah learned quickly that quiet observation was her only weapon. She watched Mr. Grigg beat a boy for singing too loud. She watched a woman be dragged into the shed and come out mute. She watched the sky change color in autumn and the blood dry on the whip. And she remembered everything. But Mariah wasn't alone. There were others, older slaves who told stories at night, who prayed quietly, who spoke in codes and symbols. They warned her of the hollow at the edge of the property, the one near the cypress grove, where the soil was soft and the air too still. "That land remembers," one old woman whispered, rocking beside the fire. "And it don't forget who it took." By the 1850s, whispers about Halcyon Grove had begun to circulate outside its gates. Field hands from nearby plantations spoke of the disappeared, men and women who had vanished from the Chamberlain property without record or sale. No one knew their names. They had no graves, just silence. When a Methodist preacher visited in 1857, he asked Jonathan about the rumors. Jonathan simply smiled and said, "Cotton doesn't grow on gossip, Reverend." He didn't receive another visit. Then came the war. In April of 1861, the Confederacy roared to life and Tennessee joined its cause. Cotton became both king and curse. Union blockades threatened exports, and slaves were more tightly controlled than ever. Jonathan Chamberlain, never one to miss a chance for influence, donated funds to the Confederate cause and began employing internal punishments on those suspected of disloyalty. The result was a fortress of fear. By 1862, the plantation's slave population was listed at 118. A year later, the ledger dropped to 90, with no corresponding sales, transfers, or deaths recorded. No explanation, no paper trail, just gone. 73 names never mentioned again. Mariah, older now, still just a girl, was beginning to understand what power meant. She'd seen where they took the vanished, to the hollow at the property's edge, past the trees no one cut and the stones no one moved. She'd seen the pit. She'd heard the moans beneath the earth. And she began to write, scratching names and words into scraps of paper, hiding them beneath floorboards, under her straw mattress, behind chimney bricks. Her tiny rebellion, her record. She would not forget. She would remember all 73, even if no one else did. In the final days of 1863, something changed. The cotton yield dropped dramatically. Jonathan grew erratic, drinking late into the night, barking at shadows. Rebecca was seen walking the halls in her nightgown, whispering into empty rooms. One of the Chamberlain children, Caroline, was sent away without notice. And then suddenly the killing stopped. But by then it was too late. The land had already swallowed its debt. And the cotton that grew afterward? It grew tall. It grew red. Winter came early in Tennessee in 1863. Frost clung to the windows of Halcyon Grove like ghostly fingerprints, and the chimney smoke curled high into gray skies as if begging the heavens to remember what was happening below. Inside the grand estate, silence reigned more absolute than any general. The house that once echoed with formal dinners and piano music had grown hollow. The war had drawn away the guests, the carriages, the letters from Richmond. The Confederacy was bleeding, and so was the Chamberlain fortune. Jonathan Chamberlain walked the corridors like a man being watched. His boots no longer rang confidently on the hardwood floors. He had grown thinner, his once oiled beard now wild with gray. At the breakfast table he barely touched his food. His son, David, 18 and proud, had left for the front lines 2 months prior, never to write again. Rebecca Chamberlain sat quietly beside him, hands wrapped tightly around a teacup. She did not speak anymore. The servants said she had taken to praying in closets, whispering names no one else knew. But the field hands knew. They heard the names in their dreams. They felt them in the soil. Mariah had survived another year. She was now just barely 20, but time on the plantation was measured differently. Childhood, womanhood, and death often blurred together. She had become quiet, deliberate, invisible. A girl with soft eyes and a sharp mind. She watched everything. In the early mornings, when frost still clung to the cotton leaves, Mariah would take to the fields and pass the hollow. No one worked near it anymore. The overseers, cruel as they were, gave it wide berth. They didn't like what the dogs did there, how they growled at the ground, tails low, ears pinned. Something under the earth had changed. Sometimes, at night, Mariah would press her ear to the floorboards of her cabin and swear she could hear movement. Not rats, not roots, movement. Inside the main house, Elias Grigg, the overseer, was losing control. Half the enslaved men were sick with fever or starvation. Tools went missing. Work slowed. The lash lost its bite. Something had shifted. Elias began to patrol at night with a lantern and pistol, barking at shadows and chasing phantoms. He accused one man of witchcraft and beat him to death in front of the cabins. The man's name was Obadiah. He was number 59 on Mariah's list. She carved a line for him into the inside wall of her cabin that night with a rusted nail. Obadiah, they weren't just names anymore. They were stories, sufferings, people. And the list grew. On January 11, 1863, the first Union troops were sighted 10 miles south of Halcyon Grove. Panic spread through the Confederate strongholds. Neighbors began to flee or hide their valuables. Some even released their slaves and made for Kentucky, hoping to save face and fortune. But Jonathan Chamberlain refused to abandon his empire. "This land is mine," he told his family. "I bled for it, built it, bled it dry. No Yankee will take it from me." He doubled down on production. Work hours extended. Punishments grew more creative and more violent. The hollow grew, too. At night, wagons were taken out, covered in canvas, loaded with silent cargo. No one dared ask what, but everyone knew. Mariah continued to write. Scraps of paper, cloth, even smudged bits of soot on the back of ledger pages. Anything she could find. Her secret diary had become more than just a record. It was resistance, memory, a weapon against forgetting. She began to hear stories from those who worked inside the main house. That David Chamberlain had died at Chickamauga, torn apart by cannon fire. That Rebecca had stopped eating. That Jonathan had ordered the last of the field hands to be taken to the shed. Mariah didn't cry. Not anymore. She waited. She watched. And she wrote. February brought snow and sickness. The cotton rotted on the stalks. The supply wagons stopped coming. Halcyon Grove became a tomb with a heartbeat. One night, smoke rose from cabin 7. A fire, small but deliberate. No one claimed it. Elias Grigg punished them all. Every adult over the age of 16 was lashed, regardless of guilt. Mariah could barely walk for 3 days. But she didn't stop writing. She wrote the names of every person still living. Every person gone. Every whisper. Every threat. Every scream she heard after sundown. She etched them onto walls, into the hem of her dress, beneath the floorboards. And she added her own name for the first time. Mariah is still here. Then, in March, came the final purge. It was quick and without warning. One night, Jonathan called all remaining field workers to the chapel, the small wooden building near the Eastern Grove. He claimed they would be redeployed, that work would shift to a new part of the land. But those who went were never seen again. Mariah didn't go. She had faked illness, hidden behind the coop until the bell stopped ringing, until the dogs stopped barking, until the screaming began. That night, she buried her diary behind the roots of the old cypress tree. She kissed the dirt, and she ran. Into the woods, into the cold, into freedom. She was found 3 days later by a Union scouting party, starving and frostbitten. She spoke very little, offered no name. Just a whisper. 73. The soldiers brought her to Nashville, where she recovered under the care of freedmen. She never returned to Halcyon Grove. But the diary she buried waited for someone brave enough to return. Someone like Eliza Monroe 162 years later. Back at the ruins of the Chamberlain estate, Eliza stood beside the hollow. A modern archaeologist team had begun gentle excavation. The bones were surfacing, some wrapped in rags, others bound. all silent, all real. She clutched Mariah's diary to her chest. Inside its final page was a single sentence. If they do not speak for us, let the earth scream instead. And it had. And it would. The sun crested low over the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the forgotten cotton fields of Halcyon Grove. The once pristine land, now wild and choked with weeds, pulsed with quiet revelation. In the hush between earth and sky, something had awakened. Not a ghost, not a scream, but the heavy exhale of truth. Eliza Monroe stood near the edge of the hollow with a clipboard, gloves, and a voice recorder clipped to her coat. Around her, the team of archaeologists from Vanderbilt University worked carefully, brushing away dirt with delicate hands. Every movement was slow, reverent. Pit 12, called one of the grad students. Possible child-sized remains. Skeletal frame incomplete. No coffin. Bound wrists. Eliza closed her eyes. They had found 37 graves so far. All unmarked. All unrecorded. All buried beneath decades of Chamberlain cotton. And none with proper funerary treatment, no headstones, no markers, no documentation. Only human remains and silence. She clicked on the recorder and began speaking in a low voice. Day 14 of the excavation. Evidence supports claims made in the 1863 journal belonging to Mariah, formerly enslaved at Halcyon Grove. Mass grave pits now confirmed. Early forensic analysis suggests blunt force trauma on more than half of the exhumed remains. Several show signs of restraints. She paused, lowering her voice. Still no official response from the County Historical Board. Back in town, news of the discovery had begun to stir public consciousness like mud in river water. Some praised Eliza's work. Others, mostly older, wealthier locals, accused her of defaming a Tennessee legacy. On a local radio station, a retired judge named Everett Dandridge, who'd grown up hearing stories about the great Chamberlains, dismissed the excavation as revisionist theater. Every family has history, he said into the microphone. But if we start digging up every patch of dirt for old bones, we'll tear down everything this state was built on. Eliza had laughed bitterly when she heard it. That was the point. Among the volunteers assisting the dig was Isaiah Reed, a local high school teacher and descendant of enslaved Tennesseans. He was the one who had first referred Eliza to the site after his grandmother passed down stories of a field that grew darker than cotton. Isaiah carried a clipboard in one hand and a folded American flag in the other. We've got enough remains to account for 45 individuals, he told her. Still a long way from 73. Eliza nodded, expression distant. I wonder if we'll find them all. Maybe not, he said gently. But they know we're looking. Those words sat with her the rest of the day. Later that afternoon, Eliza ventured into the ruins of the main house again, drawn by a hunch. The structural remains were unsafe, the floorboards bowed, and ivy curled through broken windows. But something tugged at her gut. Intuition, maybe, or the echo of Mariah's voice. She stood in what had once been the study. A bookcase had collapsed across the floor, crushed beneath time and rot. She lifted several broken boards, her hands trembling. Behind the shelf, tucked into a cavity in the wall, was a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, a set of rusted keys, a faded photograph of the Chamberlain children, and another, thinner book. Not a ledger, not a diary, a confession. It was written in Jonathan Chamberlain's hand. March 16, 1863. The fever spread faster than the news. I told Grigg to keep them away from the main house, but too many were sick already. They begged to see the doctor. There wasn't time. There wasn't enough land for separate graves. I made the choice. I had to. We buried them in the hollow. The ones who died. The ones who wouldn't die. I told myself it was mercy. But I cannot sleep. Rebecca hasn't spoken since the fourth burial. Caroline writes me from New Orleans. David is dead. I have sown my fields with blood, and yet the cotton grows. Eliza's breath caught. So the rumors had been half true. Not all 73 were killed by the lash or the bullet. Some had died of disease. Others were murdered to prevent the spread. but all of them were discarded, unmarked, forgotten, until now. 2 days later, Eliza stood before the County Historical Board. Her presentation was thorough soil analysis, ground-penetrating radar, Mariah's journal, Chamberlain's confession, photographs of the exhumed remains, skeletal reconstructions, timeline overlays, names. Silence followed her final slide. Councilman Arthur Breedlove, a portly man with a silver bolo tie, finally cleared his throat. "You're asking us to declare Halcyon Grove a state-recognized historic atrocity site?" "Yes," Eliza said firmly, "and to fund a permanent memorial with full acknowledgement of the lives lost here." Another member, a younger black woman named Marlene Waters, nodded solemnly. "What about the Chamberlain family? Any living heirs?" "One," Eliza replied. "A great-great-grandson. Name's Ethan Chamberlain. Lives in Vermont. Teaches business law. I reached out. He hasn't responded." Breedlove scoffed, not surprised. That night, the wind howled again over the fields, rattling the pine trees and sending fallen leaves swirling across the excavation site. A temporary perimeter had been set up, orange fencing, portable lights, security tape. But no fence could keep out memory. Mariah's grave, if there was one, had still not been found. But her voice, captured in the pages Eliza had read so many times she could recite them from memory, rang louder now than any monument could. "Do not let the earth forget us. Do not let their children profit from our bones. If they forget our names, let them remember our suffering." Eliza stood beneath the hollow moonlight and whispered, "We remember. On the 15th day of the dig, they found the 73rd body. It was at the edge of the cypress grove, far from the other pits. Alone, shallow, wrapped in what appeared to be a child's quilt. A copper button was found near the bones. Etched faintly into it were the letters M.R. Mariah." Eliza fell to her knees. Isaiah stood beside her, head bowed. "She stayed behind to bury the truth," he said softly. "And now we've brought it back." "No," Eliza whispered. "She did." Ethan Chamberlain had never been to Tennessee. He had grown up in Connecticut, gone to prep school in New Hampshire, and now taught business law at a small liberal arts college in Vermont. He drank black coffee, wore pressed shirts, and corrected people when they mispronounced arbitration. His father rarely spoke about family history, and when he did, it was vague. Old money, lost in the Depression, a mystery best left buried. But when the letter arrived, formal, thick cream paper embossed with the seal of the Tennessee Historical Commission, he didn't ignore it. He read it twice, then 3 more times. Then he Googled the name Halcyon Grove, and then he saw it. 73 bodies. Cotton fortune. The Chamberlain name. His name. 2 weeks later, Ethan stepped off a regional flight into the dense August heat of Nashville. The air clung to him like sweat and accusation. A university representative met him at the gate with a rental car and a stack of printed documents. "You'll be staying in Pulaski," the woman said, "about 30 miles from the Chamberlain property. We've arranged for private security and press discretion." Ethan didn't respond. He just took the keys and drove. As he wound through the southern hills, past rusted barns and sprawling fields, the landscape began to change. What had once been romantic in a distant, academic way, antebellum heritage, Southern legacy, now felt stark, heavy, oppressive, the kind of beauty that demanded silence. He passed a small protest on the highway shoulder, 6 locals holding signs, "Chamberlain blood money? Where are the reparations?" "We know the truth." He looked away. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Halcyon Grove. The estate looked worse than he imagined, more ruin than relic. The house was skeletal, the columns cracked, the roof sagging. Orange fencing surrounded most of the site, with archaeologists still working beneath canopies. News vans lingered down the road, waiting. A woman in jeans and work boots met him at the gate. "Eliza Monroe," she said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." "Professor Monroe," Ethan said. "I've read your reports, and I've read your great-great-grandfather's ledgers. she replied without flinching. Let's take a walk. They moved slowly toward the field. The grass had been cleared in patches. Small white flags dotted the soil like ghosts whispering for attention. Each one marked a grave. Ethan paused. And these are? 73, she said. Though we believe there were more. These were just the ones we could find. He rubbed his jaw. This land, it belongs to me? Legally, yes, she said. Morally? That's up to you. Inside a temporary structure near the excavation site, Eliza laid out several items on a folding table. These belong to Mariah, she said. A former slave here. She kept a record of every person who disappeared. Hid her journal in the wall. We matched some of the names to the bodies we found. Ethan stared at the fragile papers. Faded ink. Torn edges. One page read, David, age 8. Took him at night. Didn't scream. Another read, Josie bled out after the third child. Buried her under the cypress. She wrote all of this, Eliza said softly. At 19, before escaping, she survived. But she carried it with her. Ethan's voice was low. And what do you want from me? She looked him in the eye. Accountability, visibility, a reckoning. You don't have to apologize for your ancestors. But you do have to decide what you're going to do with what they left behind. He didn't answer. That night, Ethan stayed in the Pulaski Hotel, alone with silence and paper. He reviewed land deeds, trust accounts, legal liabilities. Technically, the estate was worth millions, even now, even ruined. Developers had already contacted him, interested in building upscale farmhouses, a golf resort, a private history-themed B&B. Blood money. He poured a drink and stared at the TV as a news anchor discussed the excavation. The Chamberlain site may represent one of the largest mass slave burials ever found in the state of Tennessee. He turned it off. At 2 a.m., he opened Mariah's diary again. He read one entry over and over. If the world forgets us, it will happen again, and again, until someone says, no more. The following morning, Ethan called a press conference. Dozens of reporters gathered near the estate gates. Protesters and counter-protesters stood on opposite sides of the field, each holding signs. Some chanted, some wept, some just stared. Ethan stepped to the microphone. My name is Ethan Chamberlain, he began, voice steady but soft. This land has belonged to my family for over 200 years. It was built on pain, violence, and the theft of human life. That truth is not distant. It is present. It is beneath our feet. He took a breath. I am not here to defend my ancestors. I am here to say that I will not profit from their crimes. Murmurs spread through the crowd. I am donating the entire Chamberlain estate to the state of Tennessee, with 3 conditions. 1. That this land becomes a historical and educational memorial. 2. That every known victim is named, honored, and remembered. And 3. That descendants of those buried here be involved in its governance. He stepped back from the mic. Let the truth own this place. Not me. The field was quiet for a long moment. Then came applause. And then tears. That night, Eliza found Ethan sitting on the back porch of the ruined manor, drinking sweet tea, staring at the darkened grove. You did the right thing, she said. I did the only thing I could live with, he replied. But it doesn't change what they did. No, she agreed. But it changes what comes next. Somewhere beneath the cypress trees, the wind shifted. The flags in the soil fluttered softly. Cicada cried out, then stopped. And in the hush of twilight, the land exhaled again. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. And maybe, just maybe, a beginning. The paper was torn at the edges, stained with smoke and rain. Some pages had holes where insects had chewed through time. But Mariah's handwriting, careful, slanted, painfully deliberate, had survived. I write because I remember. And if I remember, they can't vanish. Eliza Monroe sat alone in the archive room at Vanderbilt University, the original journal spread out under low lighting. White gloves covered her fingers. Her recorder clicked on softly beside her. Mariah had never intended for her words to be found. She had buried them like seeds, hopeful, scared, determined. Now, more than 160 years later, those words were breathing again. Eliza read aloud, slowly. April 2nd, 1863, they took Caleb this morning. Said he had fever. I don't think he did. He just wouldn't stop talking about freedom. That makes them nervous. Miss Rebecca cried when they took him, but not where anyone could see. I saw it, though. Her eyes were red at breakfast. She pretends not to know what her husband is. I think she knows. I think she just can't live with it either. Caleb was the 26th. April 7th, 1863, I dug under the floor again today. Made a space for my pages. The dirt is soft like breath. If they ever find this book, I want them to know the names. There was a boy, 7 maybe, never spoke even when beaten. His mother died birthing him. They called him It. I named him Samuel. They buried him behind the coop. Shallow, like he didn't matter. He was number 33. The journal wasn't just a list. It was a map of cruelty. But it was also full of quiet, fierce resistance. Mariah recorded not only the deaths, but the small acts of defiance. A woman who refused to cook until her son was returned. A man who spit in Elias Grigg's face and paid for it with his life. Children who whispered names in the night so they wouldn't forget. It was not a diary. It was testimony. Eliza turned to one of the last entries. October 22nd, 1863, they've started taking them in wagons now. No more ceremony. Just names on a list and then they're gone. I've seen the hollow. There's no end to it. The land sags is tired of swallowing. I hear them at night. I swear I do. Not voices, just breath. If I don't make it, bury this. Somewhere it can survive. If someone finds it, say our names. Out loud. That's all we ever wanted. I am Mariah. I remember them. When Eliza finished reading, she turned off the recorder and sat in silence. There was no way to read those pages and remain unchanged. Mariah's words had a gravity to them, the kind of weight that didn't just inform, it transformed. She thought back to the excavation, the protests, the press conference, Ethan's trembling voice. None of it mattered without Mariah's voice at the center. In the months that followed, the journal was digitized and transcribed. A public reading was held at Fisk University. Actors, community members, and descendants of the enslaved came together to speak the names aloud. All 73. Not numbers. Not statistics. People. Samuel. Obadiah. Josie. Caleb. Grace. Micah. Ruth. Abram. Delilah. Mariah. Isaiah Reed, the teacher who had joined the excavation, helped develop a curriculum based on the journal. It's more than history, he told his students. It's a challenge. To see the past not as something that happened, but something we carry. One student, a young girl named Zoe, raised her hand. Was Mariah scared? Isaiah smiled softly. Every day. But she didn't let fear win. She turned it into something more powerful. Back at the newly renamed Halcyon Memorial Site, construction began on the center that would house the remains, the records, and the story. At the heart of it would be a room, circular, white, quiet. Along the inner walls, the names of the 73 would be engraved in stone. At the center, beneath glass, would rest Mariah's journal. Above it, etched in iron. She remembered so we could. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the excavation's first day, Ethan Chamberlain returned to Tennessee for the memorial dedication. He stood before the gathered crowd, beside Eliza and Isaiah, and spoke not as an heir to wealth, but as a witness to truth. He read Mariah's final entry aloud. When he finished, no one clapped. They just stood, in silence, in honor. That night, as dusk fell over the field, Eliza wandered alone to the edge of the grove. Fireflies flickered. The earth, newly turned and honored, no longer felt like it was holding a secret, felt like it was telling a story. She whispered, "Thank you." The wind stirred the trees, and for the first time in a long time the land felt still. When construction crews first stepped into the hollow, many hesitated. The air, thick with history, seemed to weigh down even the bulldozers. Ground-penetrating radar had mapped out every inch of the field, and the archaeologists had cleared the remains with care. But still, the soil felt sacred, disturbed but never desecrated. This was where the worst had happened. This was where 73 people were buried without ceremony. This was where the land, for generations, had kept its terrible silence. But now it would speak. The plan for the Halcyon Memorial Site had been drawn with deliberate intention. Every element was designed not to erase the past, but to confront it with dignity. The hollow itself would not be filled in, nor built over. It would be preserved, open, raw, and encircled by a quiet garden. A path of reclaimed wood would wind around the perimeter. Along it, small glass panels would display the names of the buried, etched into bronze and backlit at night. At the center of the hollow, a single tree, a black walnut native to the region, had been planted. It stood exactly where the first mass grave had been located. Its roots would grow downward into the pain and upward into the healing. Isaiah Reed had chosen it. Something strong but not silent, he said. Something that will still be standing when the rest of us are gone. Eliza Monroe returned often during construction, monitoring progress, refining the educational center's exhibits, and working with community leaders. The site was no longer just an academic project. It had become personal, a mission. One afternoon, as she walked the trail through the hollow, she noticed an older woman sitting quietly on one of the benches. Dressed in black, the woman had her hands folded in her lap, a small bouquet of cotton and wildflowers beside her. Eliza approached gently. "Afternoon," she said. The woman looked up, eyes sharp and kind. "I'm Ophelia Jenkins," she said. "My grandmother was born in Giles County. Used to tell stories about this place. Said her great-aunt disappeared working for the Chamberlains." Eliza sat beside her. "Did she ever mention a name?" she asked. Ophelia nodded. "Ruth." Eliza's breath caught. "That name's in the journal. Mariah wrote about her. Said she tried to fight back. She would have," Ophelia said, her voice proud and trembling. "She was always that kind, brave." They sat together for a long time in the quiet, the past alive between them. Not a ghost, but a memory finally unburied. The memorial opened to the public on a warm April morning. Hundreds came, some from local towns, some from across the country. Journalists, students, clergy, artists, descendants, skeptics, black and white, old and young, survivors of generational trauma and those just beginning to understand it. The ceremony began in silence. Then came music, traditional spirituals sung by a local choir, echoing across the field like a prayer finally answered. Isaiah read passages from Mariah's journal. Ethan Chamberlain stood behind the podium, his voice quiet but clear. "No amount of land or money can undo what was done here, but truth can build what lies tried to bury." Applause was soft, reverent. Tears were common. So was awe. Later, as people walked the path around the hollow, some knelt to place flowers. Others traced their fingers along the names. One woman, herself a teacher, read each aloud in a whisper, her lips barely moving, but determined to let no one go unnamed. Inside the new visitor center, displays told the full story. The rise of the Chamberlain dynasty, the horrors of the plantation system, the forced labor behind the cotton fortune, and the lives of those enslaved. Mariah's original journal was the centerpiece, encased in glass and flanked by an interactive digital display. Students tapped through the names, learned their stories, and left digital messages behind. The most common phrase typed again and again was, "We remember." A month after the opening, Eliza received a letter from a school in rural Arkansas. "Dear Ms. Monroe, our 5th grade class learned about Mariah this year. We each picked a name from her journal and wrote poems about them. We didn't know about this part of history before. We're glad we do now. We want to come visit the hollow. Can we? Sincerely, Ms. Letson's class." Eliza wrote back by hand. "Yes. You are exactly who it was made for." In the years that followed, the Halcyon Memorial Site became a model. Not for tourism, but for reckoning. Other states took notice. Communities began asking hard questions. Historians, once told to stick to the facts, were now being asked to lead uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Universities hosted panels. Churches held vigils. Descendants held reunions on land their ancestors had worked and bled upon. The soil still remembered, but now so did the people. On the 10th anniversary of the excavation, Eliza returned to the hollow alone. The tree had grown tall, over 30 feet now. The shadow stretched wide across the land. Children were playing near the visitor center. A guide was telling a story. Somewhere, someone was whispering Mariah's name. Eliza placed a new flower at the base of the tree. "You did it," she said quietly. "You brought them home." And the tree rustled in reply, not with wind, but with peace. The Chamberlain Hollow no longer whispered secrets. It spoke clearly now, not just to the curious, but to the courageous. In the years since the memorial's founding, the story of Halcyon Grove had moved from a footnote in obscure Southern history to the center of a national reckoning. School textbooks included excerpts from Mariah's journal. Documentaries were made. College students wrote theses about intergenerational trauma and land ethics. Churches, some built on land once worked by slaves, began issuing formal apologies and offering restitution. It had become more than a memorial. It was a movement. 20 years after the first excavation, the Chamberlain Hollow was not just preserved, it was thriving. Wildflowers bloomed along the garden paths. The black walnut tree now towered over the hollow like a sentinel of truth, its roots tangled in sacred soil. At its base, visitors still came every day. Families, school buses, civil rights pilgrims, descendants, survivors of systemic amnesia. They came not to mourn, but to remember and to learn forward. One visitor left a note in the guest book. "I brought my son here because I wanted him to see that truth can be painful, but it's also powerful. Thank you, Mariah. Thank you for telling the truth when no one else would." The Mariah Initiative in 2043, the U.S. Department of Education formally partnered with the Halcyon Memorial Foundation to create the Mariah Initiative, a nationwide program designed to teach students about local histories of racial violence and resilience. It provided funding for community oral history projects, excavation of potential burial sites, and traveling exhibits. The first exhibit, "They Were Here," opened in Atlanta and toured 13 cities in its first year. Each stop included a tribute to Mariah's words. "If the world forgets us, it will happen again and again, until someone says, 'No more.'" Those words had become a national touchstone, engraved on banners, printed on t-shirts, and recited in classrooms. It was no longer just history. It was civic responsibility. The Chamberlain family's continued role. Ethan Chamberlain had retired from teaching but never from advocacy. He remained active on the board of the Memorial Foundation and helped fund scholarships for descendants of the enslaved, prioritizing those with connections to Giles County. "I can't undo what my name was built on," he told a crowd at the 25th anniversary of the excavation. "But I can help build something else." He died at 87 peacefully and was buried not in the family plot, but near the hollow. A simple headstone that read, "Ethan Chamberlain, he gave the land back." He listened. Mariah's voice in the world. No one knows exactly how Mariah died. Some believe she made it all the way to Nashville, lived to old age, and told her story in fragments to anyone who would listen. Others say she was recaptured, disappeared into a second set of records never recovered. But her journal remained. Her truth survived. Her legacy expanded far beyond Tennessee. A children's book based on her life, Mariah's Tree, became a bestseller. A biopic won an Academy Award. A statue of her, seated, writing in a small notebook, gaze unflinching, was installed at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. But it was the tree in the hollow that held her best. Planted above the place where 73 lives were discarded, it now grew taller each year. Its shade fell over young students listening to guides read her words. It dropped walnuts that were collected and replanted at schools and churches across the South. Mariah always rooted. Mariah now everywhere. What the hollow became. The word hollow once meant an absence, a void. But at Chamberlain Hollow it came to mean something else. It became a space filled, not with cotton or silence or the weight of denial, but with memory, with names, with reclamation. It became a place where people learned that justice doesn't always come fast, but when it comes, it speaks with the voices of those once denied. It became a model of what happens when truth is told, listened to, and lived with. The final word, the last line of Mariah's journal, is now engraved in stone, just before visitors exit the main exhibit. It does not ask for pity. It does not plead for vengeance. It says only, "We lived. Remember us fully." And so they do, every day, one visitor at a time, one name at a time, one truth at a time. 3.